Welcome to Discovering Joy with Roy, Part 2, the Beatitudes. I'm Roy. We've been studying this series of Jesus' Beatitudes found in Matthew 5 at the beginning of his famous Sermon on the Mount. Today and for the next few videos, we're going to look at blessings Jesus promises that are not in the Sermon on the Mount. Today's comes from Matthew 25:34. Come you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. Now, before we go any further, let me encourage you to hit pause. Then take up your Bible and read all of the chapter. Then hit play. I'll wait right here while you read. Welcome back. As you read, you must have noticed this theme. Jesus is promising we'll get what's coming to us. In the 8th video, we looked briefly at the prodigal son, restless in his father's home and eager to experience life on his own terms. He wanted his share of the inheritance and he wanted it now. Sadly, he didn't want enough. He made a young man's common mistake, dreamed only a young man's dreams. He had no way of knowing what richer treasures lay ahead, riches beyond his imagining. He sacrifices, his larger legacy in the impatience of youth. A child's dream is not the adolescent's dream, nor does the ambitious youth lust after old age's legacy. Fortunately, our dreams change as we mature. I surprised myself, for example, in my 50s, when I took a drastic action doing something I'd once have thought impossible. I began giving away my library. I'd never counted the volumes, but my holdings at the church covered the 4 walls of my study and more. And then there were the 2 walls full of Bible study and other books at home. And in addition, I kept another small collection in my college office. In the past, every time we had moved, I gave away boxes full of books, keeping only what I call the necessary tools. But this time was different. We'd been in Mesa 16 years and we weren't moving. The giving of books didn't signal a change of address, but a change of heart. Age is the difference, I suppose. I was older. By the way, speaking of older, I was in a national committee meeting and one of the rising stars pointed out to the whole group assembled just how old I was. Why, Roy's so old, he said, if he were a car, we'd have to keep a pan under him. The young whippersnapper. Well, for all my preaching career, I paid dearly, too dearly, my wife would say, to collect those books. Essential to my trade, I rationalized. Well, either that or essential to my ego. But in my 50s, the drive to possess waned. I was no longer interested in accumulating things, even things as important as my library. I began seeking a more substantial, more lasting inheritance. Perhaps I'd been influenced more than I was aware by the legacy my father left me. For many years, he fretted that he wouldn't be able to leave his 3 children any kind of estate. When he died, we were all surprised that he did have a modest one, enough to leave my sister, my brother, and me about $10,000 apiece. True to the family tradition, I almost immediately wiped mine out in a bad investment. Like the prodigal son, I squandered my inheritance. Only the money, though, which was the least of Dad's legacy to me. He was a good role model. He provided an example I've been drawing on all my life. He was an interesting person. He gave us a host of indelible memories. A caring father. He left his children with a strong sense of having been loved and cheered for. He was a believer with a modest but a real faith, and he encouraged our belief in God. That was our real inheritance. It can't be stolen or squandered on a bad investment. I wouldn't trade it for anything else. But Jesus says, you and I have another blessing coming, available for the taking now. In 3 simple stories in Matthew 25, which I hope you've read now, Jesus prepares his disciples for the future that God has made ready for his blessed ones. The key player in each of these parables, they act their parts against the backdrop of God's sovereignty. Whether the subject is a wedding, the settling of financial accounts, or the final separation of the saved from the lost. In each instance, God acts judiciously. He's known what he's been doing from the beginning, since the creation of the world, it says. Wise are those who heed Jesus' words. They'll be ready. The first story is of the wise and foolish bridesmaids. It's a one-point sermon, a quietly dramatic tale told to pave the way for the moral, which is this: therefore, keep watch, because you don't know the day or the hour. The bridegroom is coming, that's Christ is coming. The diligent will be prepared. The negligent will be left out. Any bridesmaid who fails to get ready will miss the fun. Well, the parable couldn't be more straightforward. To ensure that we understand what that readiness entails, Jesus then tells the story of the talents. Once again, he turns his disciples' attention to the future, to his return, when, without apparent warning, he will appear and he will ask his stewards to turn in their books for the audit. The moral of that tale is simple also. Be faithful in using God's investment now, so that when the books are settled, then your stewardship of his resources will show a handsome profit. The parable of the sheep and the goats wraps up Jesus' trilogy on the final judgment. Once more, the Lord drives home a constant theme in his teaching. Blessings are for the benevolent. Now, this passage we're going to study more closely, because it contains one of Jesus' Beatitudes. In fact, it yields additional Beatitudes. We might word it this way: blessed are the unself-conscious. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. I've just read Matthew 25, verses 35 and 36, but later in verses 37 through 39, they ask, well, when did that happen? They didn't know. They were just following the dictates of their compassionate hearts. I understand that the early church father Tertullian was of the opinion that we won't chew in heaven. Our resurrection bodies won't need physical sustenance, he decided. We'll still need teeth, though, because otherwise, he said, we would look funny. Without them, we would be too self-conscious. Another early church leader, Cyprian of Carthage, had his own views on the subject. He discouraged women from wearing face powder in this life. He said they don't want to run the risk that God might fail to recognize them when they appear before him, powderless. Well, what are we going to look like in heaven? We don't know any more than Tertullian or Cyprian did. Whatever form our body takes, we won't need any mirrors in our heavenly house. Primping will be out of fashion, as that would just be calling attention to ourselves, trying to impress people. On this subject, Tertullian is wrong. We will not be self-conscious in heaven, and it's really inappropriate on earth. As those on the Master's right demonstrate, genuine compassion displays such ease in giving and grace in tending the needy that it can't even remember doing it. So, we'll be unselfconscious, we'll be proactive. Blessed are the proactive. Look at the verbs here. You fed me. You gave me drink. You invited me. You clothed me. You looked after me. You visited me. In other words, you saw my plight and you acted. You didn't wait to be asked. The initiative was yours. You weren't trying to be religious. You weren't even thinking about God at the time. You certainly weren't trying to score points with Him. You just reached out as one human being to another. Ironically, when you were feeling least religious, God was quite aware of what you were doing. Now, putting these three stories together, we're to understand that Jesus desires disciples who were aware that the Lord could return at any time. And that we're to be good stewards of the resources that God has provided. And that we're to look for opportunities to help others in need. The righteous do good deeds that in and of themselves seem less religious than humane. They're acts of kindness that should be routine among human beings. What a different concept of religion this is. The Lord has nothing to say in this chapter about preparing for Judgment Day through burnt offerings or observing holy days or holding the proper doctrines. What He does say, though, is this. Blessed are those who can see the little people. I tell you the truth. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did it for me. Jesus is concerned about the least of these brothers, as concerned as He is about the greatest. No one is to be ignored. Dr. Paul Brand, a famous missionary doctor of an earlier generation, one who led us to know how to treat lepers, was famous for his work among lepers. And lepers are so easy to overlook. For centuries, they were, in fact, the least. One of Dr. Brand's patients, named Sadan, once told him, "I'm happy that I have the disease leprosy, Dr. Brand." And the good physician looked at him with incredulity. But Sadan explained, "Without leprosy, I would have spent my life trying to rise in society. Because of it, I've learned to care about the little people." When he heard this, Dr. Brand thought of the words of Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf. And she said, "I'm grateful for my handicap, for through it I found my world, myself, and my God." One little person is the girl in the well-traveled joke who reads Psalms 23 this way, "Surely good Mrs. Murphy shall follow me all the days of my life." Her reading was righter than she knew. Don't we Christians testify that goodness and mercy have actually followed us all the days of our lives? And they were dressed up like human beings, like Mrs. Murphy. As a child, in my formative teens, as a struggling young adult, through my most productive years, and now into my 9th decade, I can testify God's goodness and mercy are still my companions. And they're usually incarnated in the many Mrs. Murphys who have blessed my life, although almost as often as Mr. Murphy or one of their many offspring. It isn't always easy to concentrate in a discussion with the Murphys because the subject, especially if you've been talking about yourself, invariably changes. They're not just concerned about your welfare, these Murphys, but about the children, the handicapped, the oddballs, the aging, the victimized. Thank God for the Murphys in our church. They will not allow us to be satisfied that we've done enough to tear down the barriers that prevent the blind and the deaf and the abused and the mentally and emotionally disadvantaged, the marginalized, the different, from finding their way into and feeling at home among God's people. The Murphys won't let us gossip about, or what's worse, ignore the alcoholic, the drug addict, the victims of vicious diseases, and equally vicious human predators. They wonder what more can be done for the aging and the lonely and the fatherless and the excluded. Is there anyone their restless eyes don't see? If you raise a point that maybe the church has collected a pretty unsavory collection of sinners, the Murphys immediately remind you of the church at Corinth. Aren't you grateful for Corinth? They'll ask. Their point is that church in that city was populated by Corinthians, if you please. And everyone in the first century knew what Corinthians were like. Various ethnic types, merchants, idolaters, prostitutes, charismatics, prudes, sexual profligates, the quite wealthy and the poor, and the whole and the broken. A veritable kaleidoscope of sinners lived in that wicked city. Corinth was famous for them. People traveled from far and wide to look at them. In Athens and Rome, playwrights paraded them on the stage for the titillation of the voyeurs in the audience. And some of these Corinthians came to church. And when they did, the Murphys took them in. And the Apostle Paul dubbed them saints. It didn't matter if their skin hue was darker than others, and their secrets were even darker. If they limped, or they squinted, or they scratched themselves in public, the Murphys weren't turned off. Goodness and mercy for the little people. And then blessed are those for whom heaven has begun. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. This parable is about heaven. And we'll return to this subject again in another video, but for now, let's speculate a bit. What do you suppose these sheep are going to do in eternity? The scriptural glimpses of heaven are few, and the pictures they give us are only tantalizing at best. Surely the Lord won't imagine our imagining what it'll be like. Maya Angelou, who often captures the anguish of the African American experience in her poetry, has some pretty definite ideas of what heaven will be like, or ought to be. In one of my favorites among her poems, she tells the preacher not to promise her streets of gold or free milk. Paradise for her would be where she can find loyal families and nice strangers and jazz. She doesn't have to worry. Oh, I'm not certain about the jazz part. A friend of mine is sure that there will surely be a steady diet of Bach on the organ. But for sure, she'll find some nice strangers. The Murphys will be there. You know they'll be there because it is to them that Jesus says, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world." He's talking about people who are experiencing the down payment on their heavenly reward while they are still on this side of the grave. They're becoming more and more like Jesus. He was the one who spotted the beggar in the temple, the man that everyone else had overlooked. When creaky adults would have ushered their little children away from him, he invited them to come closer. When a sick woman touched his clothes, He could feel the power go out from him, and he healed her. For the most part, he taught goodness and mercy by example. But on one remarkable occasion, he let everyone know that his ministry was theirs also. When he raised Lazarus from the tomb, the Lord said two amazing things. First, to Lazarus. His friend had already been put away, out of sight, for days. He undoubtedly smelled. Lazarus, Jesus called out to him in a loud voice that would be obeyed, come out. I want you here, where you belong, with your family among the living. And Lazarus came out, breathing again, but badly handicapped. He couldn't walk well. His feet were bound. He couldn't talk right either. His face was probably distorted behind the cloth. His tongue thick. His words unintelligible yet. He was back from the land of the dead, but not yet ready for full conversation with the living. He was at this point like one of the little people. So Jesus said the second amazing thing, this time to the bystanders, you take off the grave clothes and let him go. Now you must become involved. I can bring the dead and disadvantaged and different to life again, but you must free them and feed them and welcome them into the embrace of my Father's family. Well, that's our assignment, church. It's always been our assignment. If you choose to accept it, one day you will take your inheritance. And on that day, even more than what you've experienced so far, you'll be filled with joy. I bid you joy.